Is that a toy? The words cut across the hot morning tarmac like a whip, sharp, dripping with disbelief and amusement. Earl Whitaker's hands rested lightly on the orange rifle he carried, a relic polished by decades of sun and sweat, and yet every scuff, every nick, told a story no Marine in the line could see. Gunnery Sergeant Cole Maddox laughed, loud and unrestrained, drawing the attention of every sniper in the squad as he waved a hand toward the faded paint. Seriously, Whitaker, is that your Halloween prop? The sun glared off the metal, casting a faint reflection across Earl's lined face, but he didn't flinch, didn't smile. He simply adjusted the sling, his pale blue eyes scanning the distant ridge where the target lay, 4,000 yards away, a speck almost invisible in the heat haze. The younger Marines whispered among themselves, shuffling feet and checking ballistic computers, their state-of-the-art gear humming in the oppressive morning heat, all failing to account for the wind shear twisting unpredictably through the valley. Earl shifted his weight, a slow, deliberate motion, and the faint scent of gun oil mixed with the dry dust of the range. Maddox leaned in closer, curiosity blending with arrogance, crouching to inspect a scratch near the stock, a mark that had survived both combat and time. "That's just a dent, old man," Maddox said, smirking. "Nothing a paint job can't fix." Earl's lips tightened. He traced the scar with a finger, feeling the memory beneath it, the rotor wash, the humid jungle, the stifling heat of a day spent crouched, waiting, observing. A subtle nod from him and Lance Corporal Ryan Keller, standing quietly to the side, caught the shift in tension, the sudden gravity settling over the range. Earl lifted the rifle slowly, shouldering it with a grace that seemed rehearsed, yet effortless, every motion speaking of muscle memory older than anyone present. The Marines, still chuckling, followed his actions with incredulous eyes as he raised the scope to his shoulder, scanning, calculating. No words were exchanged. The faint hum of the wind over flags and the metallic clink of range equipment were the only sounds. Maddox scoffed again, impatient, but the humor faded as Earl exhaled slowly, letting the barrel settle, a slight tremor in his breath ignored by the steady hands that had never failed him. A bead of sweat slid down his temple, catching the light, and then Earl Whitaker pressed the trigger, a dry, muted click that barely cut through the day. Silence. The Marines blinked, waiting for something, anything, but the world seemed to pause. 4,000 yards away, the distant target's sensor blinked, a sharp, green confirmation flashing in the sun. The impossible shot had been made. Whispers rose, low and hesitant, as Ryan Keller stepped forward, eyes wide, realizing that the orange rifle, the mocked relic, had just defied everything their instruments had calculated. Earl lowered the rifle with calm certainty, not a word spoken, but the weight of decades pressed into that small, deliberate movement. Maddox's jaw tightened. The other Marines froze, sensing that this was not a fluke, that the old man's presence carried an authority older than any rank, deeper than any training, and that the orange rifle was no longer a prop, but a bridge between past and present, skill and legend, silence and awe. The hum of the morning settled over Camp Redstone like a weight as Earl Whitaker lowered the orange rifle from his shoulder, eyes still tracing the distant target with quiet precision. The Marines, frozen in a mix of awe and confusion, whispered to each other, glancing at Gunnery Sergeant Cole Maddox, whose expression had shifted from amusement to disbelief. The heat shimmered over the asphalt, twisting the light into wavering lines that mirrored the tension. Lance Corporal Ryan Keller stepped closer, notebook in hand, recording wind direction, temperature, and the faint shift in air currents. But he did so with a reverence that bordered on fear, sensing the depth of experience behind every subtle movement Earl made. The older man adjusted the scope, feeling the familiar click under his fingers, the worn leather of the stock warmed by years of handling, and each groove, dent, and scratch resonated with memory and practice, a silent language the young Marines could not read. Maddox crossed his arms, forcing a calm he did not feel, glancing at the array of high-tech ballistic calculators, wind meters, and digital gauges surrounding them, all of which had failed the team repeatedly that morning. He gestured toward the ridge beyond the valley, skepticism in his voice. "How are you going to do this with that thing?" Earl did not respond immediately. He tilted his head slightly, eyes narrowing just enough to capture a subtle cue from the distant flags fluttering in the soft breeze, a cue that had guided him decades ago on operations no one present could remember, but that still informed every decision he made. The other Marines shifted uneasily, the sound of boots on gravel faint against the steady, almost imperceptible exhale from Earl, each breath measured, controlled, like the rhythm of a seasoned observer who had spent hours in heat, rain, and sun, watching, waiting, calculating. He moved methodically to a small weathered case, retrieved a single round, and loaded it with hands that betrayed none of the tremor expected from age, each motion deliberate, studied, and precise. Maddox watched, tension tightening his jaw, unsure if he should laugh, intervene, or simply step back and watch the impossible unfold. The orange rifle now rested against Earl's shoulder once more, aligned with the distant target, and in the pause before action, the camp seemed to hold its collective breath, the distant hum of range equipment, the flutter of flags, even the faint ripple of heat from the ground, all conspiring to create a moment suspended between disbelief and reality. Earl exhaled slowly, adjusted the stock against his cheek, and settled the scope on the minuscule silhouette beyond the ridge, feeling the faint currents of air that bent through the valley, the warmth of the sun, the dry dust, and the distant vibrations through the ground, translating all of it into a single, deliberate action. The rifle's trigger met his finger, a tactile confirmation, and the world seemed to pause again as the weight of experience, memory, and skill coalesced into a quiet inevitability. The Marines, including Maddox, could only watch, some frozen in shock, others with eyes wide, as Ryan Keller scribbled rapidly, trying to capture something he would never fully understand, the interplay of history, instinct, and subtle environmental cues that had just been summoned by a man who had waited decades for this moment of silent mastery. The atmosphere on the range had changed, although no one wanted to admit it aloud. The laughter that had filled the morning air was gone, replaced by uneasy silence and the occasional crackle of a radio somewhere beyond the firing line. Gunnery Sergeant Cole Maddox stood rigid beside the observation platform, pretending to study the digital readouts on a tablet while his attention remained fixed on Earl Whitaker. Something about the old veteran irritated him even more now than before. It was not confidence. It was not arrogance. It was the complete absence of any need to impress anyone. Earl sat quietly on a weathered bench near the firing position, the orange rifle resting across his knees. The faded paint looked almost ridiculous against the sleek black equipment surrounding him. Precision scopes, laser range finders, ballistic computers, and advanced sensors covered nearly every table on the range. Yet none of them drew attention the way that battered rifle did now. Lance Corporal Ryan Keller walked over slowly, carrying a clipboard he had barely touched for the last 10 minutes. He hesitated before speaking. "Sir, where did you learn to read the wind like that?" Earl looked toward the distant hills rather than at the young Marine. The corners of his weathered eyes narrowed slightly as another gust moved across the valley. "The wind tells you everything if you stop talking long enough to listen." Ryan glanced toward the flags. They seemed random to him, dancing in different directions with no pattern at all. Earl simply nodded toward them. "Those flags are arguing with each other. The ground is not." Ryan frowned, trying to understand. Before he could ask another question, Maddox approached. The gunnery sergeant forced a smile that failed to hide the irritation underneath. "You got lucky once. That is all." Earl remained silent. Maddox stepped closer and pointed at the rifle. "You know what bothers me? Everybody is acting like that thing is special." He reached down and tapped the side of the faded stock with a finger. The moment his hand touched the orange paint, Earl's expression changed almost imperceptibly. It was not anger. It was memory. His gaze settled on a dark burn mark hidden beneath layers of worn color near the rear of the stock. For a second, the sounds of Camp Redstone seemed distant. The hum of electronics faded. The voices disappeared. Earl remembered another morning long ago. Endless heat waves rising from sun-baked ground. Rotor blades turning somewhere beyond sight. Dust drifting through the air like smoke. A younger version of himself sitting quietly beside the same rifle. The orange paint had been fresh then, bright enough to stand out against the landscape. Someone had joked that it looked ridiculous. Someone else had called it a lifesaver. The memory lingered only briefly before dissolving. Earl blinked and returned to the present. Maddox was still standing there, waiting for a reaction. "You should not touch that spot," Earl said quietly. The calmness in his voice unsettled everyone nearby. Ryan noticed it immediately. The older man had spoken fewer than 50 words since arriving, yet somehow those words carried more weight than an entire briefing room. Maddox laughed again, but this time the sound lacked confidence. "Why? Is it magical?" Several Marines chuckled nervously. Earl slowly stood, lifting the rifle with careful hands. Sunlight caught the faded orange finish. For a moment Ryan could have sworn the old veteran was looking far beyond the range, far beyond the base itself, toward a place only he could see. Then Earl glanced back toward the distant target area and said something so softly that everyone had to lean forward to hear it. "That mark is the reason I never forgot what matters." The wind shifted again. Somewhere on the far side of the valley, a warning tone suddenly echoed from a monitoring station, sharp enough to make every Marine turn toward the sound. The warning tone echoed across the valley for only a few seconds before cutting off, but the effect lingered. Every Marine on the range turned toward the monitoring station perched near the far ridge. A technician inside the small structure stepped outside and looked around as if he was not entirely sure what he had just seen. The dry wind pushed dust across the asphalt in thin ribbons while the distant range flags snapped in uneven rhythms. Lance Corporal Ryan Keller glanced toward the digital display mounted beside the observation platform. Numbers flickered across the screen before abruptly disappearing. Then the system reset itself. "That has never happened before," Ryan muttered. Gunnery Sergeant Cole Maddox frowned. He walked toward the display, tapped the side of the housing, and watched as a diagnostic message briefly flashed before vanishing again. The range computer had flagged something unusual. He could feel it. Yet before he could investigate further, Earl Whitaker calmly slung the rifle over his shoulder and started walking toward the bench. The old veteran moved without urgency, completely unconcerned by the attention now focused on him. That bothered Maddox more than anything. Most people would have enjoyed the moment. They would have smiled, bragged, or demanded recognition. Earl did none of those things. He simply sat down and looked toward the horizon. Ryan followed him. "Sir, what was that warning?" Earl watched a hawk circling above the distant hills before answering. Probably a machine realizing it saw something it was not expecting. Ryan blinked. The answer sounded simple, yet somehow carried a deeper meaning. Nearby, several Marines gathered around the monitoring display. Conversations spread quickly. Rumors traveled even faster. Some thought the system had malfunctioned. Others believed a sensor on the target range had failed. A few quietly wondered if the shot itself had triggered the alert. Maddox folded his arms and stared at Earl. "You knew that would happen." Earl looked up at him. "No, you were telling me that was a surprise?" Maddox asked. Earl shrugged. "The warning was. The result was not." The words landed heavily. Several Marines exchanged glances. Ryan noticed something change in their faces. The skepticism was fading. Respect was beginning to take its place. Before anyone could respond, a military utility vehicle appeared on the access road leading toward the range. Dust rose behind its tires. The vehicle stopped near the operations trailer, and a staff sergeant stepped out carrying a tablet. He spoke briefly with one of the range technicians before both men turned toward the firing line. The technician's expression changed instantly. His eyes widened. He looked toward Earl, then back at the tablet, then toward Earl again. Ryan felt a chill despite the heat. Something bigger was unfolding. The staff sergeant started walking directly toward them. His pace was quick but controlled. The conversations around the range gradually died away as everyone watched him approach. When he finally stopped a few feet from Earl, he glanced at the orange rifle, then at the old veteran himself. "Sir," he said carefully, "I need to confirm something." Earl nodded once. The staff sergeant swallowed. "Is that rifle registered under the designation Ghost Marker?" The wind seemed to disappear. Ryan felt every Marine nearby freeze. Even Maddox stopped moving. Earl remained completely still. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he looked down at the faded orange stock resting across his lap and quietly replied, "That is a name I have not heard in a very long time." Earl Whitaker remained seated, letting the attention of the Marines and staff sergeant settle fully upon him. The distant ridge seemed closer somehow, sharper in detail as though the morning heat had faded, leaving clarity in its place. He carefully rested the orange rifle across his lap, fingers tracing the familiar worn edges, feeling the grooves and tiny scars etched by decades of use. Ryan Keller stepped closer, hesitant yet compelled, eyes following the rifle's line as if trying to see what Earl saw. Maddox's posture remained rigid, arms crossed, jaw tight, the challenge in his eyes now replaced by something else, a recognition of the unseen mastery before him. Earl spoke softly, almost to himself, yet everyone within earshot leaned in. Every mark on this rifle has a purpose. Every scratch tells a story. Ignore them at your peril. The staff sergeant nodded subtly, understanding that this was more than a machine. The young Marines shifted uneasily, the weight of decades and experience pressing down on them without a word of boast or explanation. Earl adjusted the scope carefully, eyes narrowing, tracing the distant flags fluttering unevenly across the valley. He inhaled, the faint scent of gun oil mingling with dust, and exhaled slowly, a rhythm that seemed to anchor the entire range in a moment of suspended anticipation. Ryan scribbled notes rapidly, trying to capture what his mind could barely comprehend. Maddox, still incredulous, tried to regain control, stepping closer. "This is just luck, old man," he said, though the statement lacked conviction. Earl's gaze flicked to him briefly, pale blue eyes calm, unshakable. "Luck is for those who do not pay attention," he replied. The words, measured, deliberate, carried more weight than any order, more presence than any uniformed authority nearby. The wind shifted again, subtle but distinct, brushing across the flags, whispering over the uneven asphalt, carrying a faint dry rustle that only Earl seemed to notice fully. He lifted the rifle slowly, aligning it with the distant target. Not a twitch, not a hurried movement, only the grace and precision of someone who had lived every moment in perfect awareness. Maddox leaned in, a hint of doubt creeping into his confidence. Ryan's pen faltered mid-sentence, eyes wide as he watched the old veteran breathe in the valley, in the wind, in the subtle vibrations of the ground itself. Earl exhaled and steadied the scope once more, the orange rifle resting perfectly in his shoulder, each fraction of an inch measured against years of memory and instinct. Around them, time seemed to bend, compressing decades of experience into this single moment. Every Marine present felt the shift, a quiet awe settling in, heavy and undeniable. The staff sergeant glanced at the tablet again, data streams flickering in ways that defied explanation, signals triggered by something more than mechanical calculation. A distant hum, almost imperceptible, seemed to vibrate across the valley. Earl did not flinch. His hands were steady, his posture unbroken. The rifle was an extension of himself, a conduit between the past and this precise, unspoken present. Then, with a soft and deliberate movement, Earl adjusted his cheek against the stock, aligned his eye, and prepared for what was to come, a calm that radiated outward, touching every observer with the quiet authority of mastery. The world held its breath, the heat, the dust, the faint hum of electronics all fading to a near silence, leaving only the faint scrape of leather and the subtle rustle of wind as the stage for the next act of precision that would unfold. The quiet that followed the alert seemed to stretch across the entire range, pressing down on every Marine as if the air itself had grown heavier. Earl Whitaker remained seated, holding the orange rifle in his lap, the sun catching the faded paint and revealing every tiny scar and mark with deliberate clarity. His pale blue eyes scanned the distant ridge again, as if replaying the memory embedded in the rifle itself. Lance Corporal Ryan Keller stayed close, notebook ready, but he dared not interrupt, knowing that Earl's calm was part of the lesson he was about to impart. Gunnery Sergeant Cole Maddox shifted uneasily, crossing and uncrossing his arms, trying to regain composure. Yet even he felt the weight of decades of skill and experience in the old veteran's presence. A low hum of electronics and wind mixed with the dry, hot dust that rose in thin swirls across the asphalt, carrying with it the subtle sense of the range, heated metal, faint gun oil, and the earthy aroma of disturbed gravel. Earl stood slowly, slinging the rifle over his shoulder with deliberate care, his movements measured, exact, unhurried yet full of intent. The Marines instinctively took a step back, sensing that this was no ordinary demonstration, that every motion contained purpose beyond their immediate comprehension. Ryan followed at a respectful distance, eyes wide, heart beating fast from anticipation and awe. Earl approached the firing position where the target lay nearly 4,000 yards away, a tiny shape in the shimmering heat haze, almost imperceptible without focus. He crouched slightly, adjusting the scope, his fingers brushing the familiar leather of the stock, feeling every groove, every nick, every subtle curvature that had guided countless shots in days long past. Maddox tried to interject, to reclaim authority, but his voice faltered as the quiet intensity radiating from Earl held him in place. Earl whispered, more to himself than anyone else. Every detail matters. Every breeze, every shadow, every vibration tells a story. He lifted the rifle carefully to his shoulder, each adjustment precise, deliberate, the weight of the rifle and its history grounding him as if he were in perfect harmony with the environment. Ryan leaned in, trying to read the subtle cues in Earl's posture, the slight tilt of his head, the narrowing of his eyes, sensing something beyond mere calculation. The flags along the range danced, the wind shifting unpredictably, yet Earl's focus remained unbroken, reading each variation like a familiar language. Maddox could feel the tension rising, an unspoken acknowledgement that the old veteran had already moved beyond the realm of ordinary understanding, that the skill, patience, and memory encapsulated in every gesture were something he could not measure nor compete against. The distant ridge seemed sharper now, every contour and shadow accounted for in Earl's mind. He exhaled slowly, a controlled, deliberate breath, and with a quiet steadiness, began the process that would transform years of disciplined practice into a single, precise action. The range fell silent around him, the normal chatter, the shuffling of feet, even the hum of equipment fading to the background. Time seemed to stretch, compressing decades of training, observation, and instinct into the stillness of this one moment. Each Marine watched, some holding their own breath, each sensing the inevitability of what was about to unfold, knowing that the old veteran was about to demonstrate the full measure of mastery that had brought him to this point. Earl adjusted the scope one final time. The leather pressed comfortably against his cheek, and the world narrowed to the target ahead, to the rifle in his hands, to the rhythm of breath and wind and experience converging into the culmination of everything he had ever known. The valley seemed to fall into complete silence. Even the wind felt distant now, reduced to a faint whisper moving across the dry grass and weathered rocks beyond the range. Earl Whitaker remained perfectly still behind the rifle. His breathing slowed until it became almost impossible to notice. Lance Corporal Ryan Keller watched from only a few feet away, his notebook forgotten at his side. He had spent years studying marksmanship manuals, ballistic charts, and advanced targeting systems, yet none of those things explained what he was seeing. Earl was not calculating anymore. He was observing. There was a difference. The old veteran's pale blue eyes remained fixed on the distant target far beyond the visible comfort zone of every Marine on the range. Heat waves twisted through the air like transparent rivers. The flags between the firing line and the ridge pointed in conflicting directions. Every instrument on the range suggested uncertainty. Earl seemed to see certainty hidden inside it. Gunnery Sergeant Cole Maddox felt a strange knot forming in his stomach. For the first time all day, he wished he had not laughed. The feeling irritated him. He had built his career on confidence, preparation, and discipline, yet standing beside Earl made all those things feel incomplete. The old man was operating on something different, something older, something deeper. Earl adjusted the rifle slightly, less than an inch. Ryan almost missed it. The movement was so subtle that it seemed insignificant. Earl's finger rested against the trigger, not pulling, waiting, listening. The distant warning tone from the monitoring station had long since stopped, but its echo remained in everyone's mind. The staff sergeant stood silently beside the operations trailer, clutching the tablet against his chest. Several range technicians had gathered near the observation platform. None of them spoke. The entire range seemed suspended between curiosity and disbelief. Then Earl exhaled. Slowly, deliberately. The rifle settled. The moment arrived. A soft report rolled across the valley. Nothing dramatic. Nothing theatrical. Just a simple sound swallowed almost immediately by the open landscape. The projectile disappeared into the shimmering distance. Every eye followed a path nobody could actually see. Seconds passed, then more seconds. The wait felt endless. One Marine checked his watch. Another squinted through binoculars. Maddox folded his arms tighter. Ryan counted silently under his breath. The target was so far away that time itself seemed stretched. Then it happened. A sharp electronic tone erupted from the monitoring station on the distant ridge. One tone became three. Three became a continuous alert. A bright green indicator flashed across the range display. Every technician looked up simultaneously. One of them nearly dropped his headset. Another stared at the screen in complete disbelief. The system confirmed a direct center impact. Not near the center. Not within scoring distance. Dead center. The range fell silent again, somehow even quieter than before. Ryan felt the hairs rise on the back of his neck. Maddox slowly lowered his arms. Nobody laughed now. Nobody moved. Earl simply lowered the rifle and looked toward the horizon. There was no celebration. No smile. No demand for recognition. The shot seemed to mean less to him than it did to everyone else. Then another alert appeared on the monitoring display. This one was different. Red lettering scrolled across the screen. Accessing legacy records. Several technicians exchanged confused looks. The staff sergeant stared at the tablet in his hands as new information populated across the display. His face lost all color. He looked from the screen to Earl and back again. Ryan saw it immediately. Whatever record had just been opened was important. Very important. The staff sergeant swallowed hard before speaking into his radio. His voice remained professional, but Ryan could hear the tension underneath. Command, this is Redstone Range Control. We have confirmed identification. Repeat, identification confirmed. Requesting immediate notification of General Thomas Braddock. The radio transmission moved far beyond Camp Redstone within minutes. Inside a secure conference room nearly 50 miles away, General Thomas Braddock paused in the middle of a briefing as an aide quietly approached his chair. The room was filled with senior officers, digital maps, and operational reports projected across multiple screens. None of that mattered the moment the aide leaned down and whispered a single phrase into the general's ear. The change was immediate. General Braddock stopped speaking. The room fell silent. Every officer present noticed it. The general held out his hand. The aide passed him a tablet. For several long seconds he stared at the screen without saying a word. The officers around the table exchanged confused looks. Then Braddock slowly stood. His eyes remained fixed on the information in front of him. Cancel the remainder of this briefing, he said. Nobody moved. One colonel blinked in surprise. Sir. The general looked up. Now. The authority in his voice erased every question. Chairs shifted. Papers were gathered. Conversations died before they started. Within moments the room was empty except for the general and his aide. Braddock looked down at the image displayed on the tablet. It showed a faded orange rifle resting across the knees of an elderly man seated on a bench at Camp Redstone. Below the image was a designation that had not appeared in official records for decades. Ghost marker. The general slowly exhaled. I thought he was gone. Back at the range, nobody knew what was happening beyond the base. Marines continued gathering near the observation platform. Technicians monitored incoming messages. Ryan Keller watched as more personnel arrived carrying equipment and folders normally reserved for inspections by senior command. The atmosphere had changed completely. The joking and casual confidence from earlier that morning had vanished. Earl Whitaker remained seated in exactly the same spot. The attention surrounding him seemed irrelevant to him. His gaze stayed fixed on the distant hills glowing beneath the afternoon sun. Gunnery Sergeant Cole Maddox stood nearby, unusually quiet. For the first time since Ryan had known him, Maddox appeared unsure of himself. The old veteran had dismantled every assumption he had made without raising his voice even once. The staff sergeant's radio crackled again. He listened briefly before straightening his posture. His expression immediately became more serious. Range control confirms incoming command transport, he announced. Several Marines looked toward the access road. Ryan felt anticipation ripple through the group. Somebody important was coming. Very important. Dust appeared on the horizon less than 10 minutes later. Two black military vehicles emerged from the far end of the road, moving steadily toward the range. Their polished surfaces reflected the bright afternoon sunlight. Every conversation stopped. Marines instinctively adjusted their uniforms. Technicians stepped aside. Even Maddox unconsciously stood straighter. The vehicles rolled to a stop near the observation platform. The first door opened. A senior aide stepped out. Then a second. Finally, General Thomas Braddock emerged. The four-star general surveyed the range for only a moment before his eyes found Earl Whitaker. Ryan expected questions. He expected security procedures. He expected introductions. None of those things happened. The general immediately began walking toward the old veteran. Not toward the staff sergeant. Not toward the observation platform. Not toward the officers waiting to greet him. Toward Earl. Every Marine present watched in complete silence as one of the highest-ranking officers in the military crossed the range with a look of recognition that seemed to belong to another lifetime. General Thomas Braddock walked across the range with a steady pace that commanded attention without demanding it. The afternoon sun reflected off his rank insignia, but nobody was looking at the stars on his shoulders. Every eye remained fixed on the direction he was moving, straight toward Earl Whitaker. The entire range stood frozen. Marines who had spent their careers around senior officers had never seen anything quite like it. Gunnery Sergeant Cole Maddox felt the weight of every joke he had made that morning settling heavily in his chest. Lance Corporal Ryan Keller stood motionless beside the firing line, notebook forgotten at his side. The only sound was the distant flutter of range flags moving against the warm afternoon wind. Earl remained seated on the weathered bench. The orange rifle rested quietly across his lap. He looked up as the general approached. For a brief moment, neither man spoke. Decades seemed to pass silently between them. Then General Braddock stopped a few feet away and smiled. It was not the smile of a commander greeting a civilian visitor. It was the smile of a man recognizing someone he deeply respected. "Ghost marker," the general said softly. Several Marines exchanged confused glances. The name carried weight even if they did not understand why. Earl's weathered face remained calm. "Been a long time since anyone used that name," he replied. The general nodded. "Not long enough." Then something happened that nobody on the range would ever forget. General Thomas Braddock came to full attention. Every movement was precise, every motion deliberate. And then he rendered a formal salute. Complete silence swept across Camp Redstone. Ryan felt his heart skip. Maddox stared in disbelief. The highest-ranking officer any of them had ever seen in person was saluting the old man they had laughed at only hours earlier. Earl slowly stood. The rifle remained tucked beneath one arm. He returned the salute with quiet dignity. No pride, no triumph, no anger, just respect. The general lowered his hand and looked toward the orange rifle. "Do you know how many times that designation appeared during my training?" he asked. Nobody answered. Braddock looked around at the gathered Marines. Every sniper school instructor knew the stories. Every advanced marksmanship program referenced them. We studied the observations, the field notes, the impossible environmental reads. Most people assumed the man behind those records was a myth. Ryan felt a chill despite the heat. Maddox looked at Earl as if seeing him for the first time. The general continued. "The reason the system alerted today is because nobody has ever duplicated what happened here. Not once." The words settled over the range like a blanket of silence. Earl simply looked toward the distant hills. The same hills he had been studying all day. Finally, Maddox stepped forward. The confidence that had once defined him was gone. "Sir," he said quietly, looking at Earl rather than the general, "I owe you an apology." Earl studied him for a moment. Then he nodded. "You owe me nothing." Maddox looked confused. Earl glanced toward the flags dancing across the valley. "Just remember something. Equipment changes. Technology changes. The wind does not care about either one." A few Marines smiled. Ryan wrote the sentence down immediately. General Braddock laughed softly. The tension finally broke. The sun hung low over the ridge now, casting long shadows across the range. Earl picked up the rifle and started walking toward the parking area. Nobody tried to stop him. Nobody asked for photographs. Nobody asked for proof. They no longer needed it. The general watched him leave before quietly saying, "Some men spend their lives trying to be remembered. Others become legends because they never cared if they were." Earl never looked back. The orange rifle rested comfortably against his shoulder as he disappeared into the golden light. Behind him, an entire range of Marines stood in silence. listening to the wind a little more carefully than they had that morning. Some lessons could not be taught. They could only be witnessed.